What if I told you that the life you are living right now is not controlled by your circumstances, but by a few quiet sentences you repeat to yourself every single morning? Not your job, not your past, not even your current situation, but your inner voice. Because before the world ever touches you, before anyone gives you advice, before any problem shows up, you are already talking to yourself. And in that moment, you are either building your strength or slowly weakening it without even realizing it. Most people wake up and immediately step into stress, doubt, pressure, and distraction. They grab their phone, they scroll, they react, and by the time the day truly begins, their mind is already overloaded, already influenced, already off track. But there is a different kind of person. A person who understands that the first few minutes of the morning are not ordinary. They are powerful. They are shaping everything that comes after. And what you are about to hear today is not motivation for a moment. It is a mental shift that can completely change the direction of your life if you actually apply it. Because there is one simple thing you can say every morning that slowly rewires how you think, how you feel, how you act, and ultimately who you become. But the real question is, will you keep living on autopilot like most people? Or will you learn how to take control of your mind before the world takes control of you? Stay with this message until the end, because what comes next might sound simple, but it can quietly reshape everything about your future. Your morning words shape your identity before the world influences you in ways most people never consciously recognize. Yet it is in those first quiet moments after waking that the foundation of an entire day is silently constructed. Before emails, conversations, responsibilities, and opinions begin to pull at your attention, your mind is in a highly receptive state, almost like soft clay waiting to be formed, and whatever thoughts or statements you repeat during this window begin to set the tone for how you interpret everything that follows. When a person speaks doubt, delay, or negativity to themselves in the morning, even casually, it becomes the lens through which they see opportunities, challenges, and decisions throughout the day. And over time, this repetition builds a stable inner identity that feels real even when it is not aligned with their true potential. On the other hand, when a person intentionally speaks strength, direction, and clarity into their morning, they are not just expressing motivation, they are actively programming the subconscious mind to prioritize discipline over distraction and possibility over limitation. This is not about wishful thinking, but about psychological conditioning, where repeated self-directed language becomes internal instruction that guides behavior without constant conscious effort. The world is constantly trying to assign identity to people through labels, circumstances, and past performance. Yet the morning is the one moment where a person can take control of that narrative before external noise begins to compete for influence. A man or woman who consistently begins the day by affirming focus, purpose, and personal responsibility is essentially deciding in advance how they will respond to pressure, uncertainty, and temptation. And this decision, repeated daily, gradually replaces reaction with intention. Over weeks and months, this practice begins to reshape emotional stability, because the mind starts to trust the direction it is being given instead of reacting to whatever environment it finds itself in. Eventually, what a person says in the morning becomes more powerful than what the world says about them during the day, because internal language begins to override external influence, and identity becomes anchored not in circumstance, but in repetition of thought. Every single repetition becomes a silent instruction shaping choices, habits, and the unseen direction of a person's life, even when they are not aware of it, forming a mental pattern that quietly determines standards, reactions, and expectations in situations that once felt unpredictable, until eventually the morning voice becomes the strongest voice in the mind, guiding decisions without resistance, building consistency in behavior, shaping discipline where there used to be doubt, creating a foundation of mental strength that no external pressure can easily break or replace, and gradually rewiring response patterns, because repetition of positive self-talk programs the subconscious mind for success in a way that is far deeper than simple encouragement or surface-level motivation. Because the human mind is not primarily shaped by occasional thoughts, but by dominant and repeated patterns that gradually become automatic beliefs. When a person repeats specific statements about their identity, direction, and capability every morning, they are essentially engaging in mental conditioning that works much like training a muscle through consistent exercise, where the repetition is more important than intensity. At first, the mind may resist these statements, especially if current circumstances do not yet reflect them, but repetition has a way of bypassing resistance over time, slowly replacing old mental scripts with new ones that feel increasingly familiar and natural. The subconscious mind does not critically analyze whether a statement is true in the moment it is repeated. Instead, it records what is consistently reinforced and begins to treat it as a default operating belief. This is why people often find themselves acting in alignment with what they repeatedly tell themselves, even when they are not consciously aware of the shift taking place. If a person repeatedly says they are focused, disciplined, and capable of handling challenges, the subconscious begins to organize thoughts, emotions, and reactions in ways that support that identity, filtering out distractions and strengthening responses that match the repeated message. Over time, this creates what feels like an internal autopilot system that guides behavior without requiring constant effort or decision-making. The power of this process lies in its gradual nature, because change does not arrive as a sudden transformation, but as a steady replacement of inner dialogue that eventually defines outer behavior. Most people underestimate how much their internal repetition already shapes their reality, often unknowingly repeating doubt, fear, or limitation in subtle ways throughout the day, which then programs hesitation and inconsistency into their actions. Positive self-talk, when done consistently in the morning, interrupts this cycle and replaces it with intentional direction, giving the subconscious a new framework to operate from before external influences begin to compete for attention. This is why successful individuals often emphasize the importance of controlling inner dialogue, because once the subconscious accepts a repeated belief, it begins to protect and reinforce it through habits, emotional responses, and decision-making patterns that align with it, even in situations of pressure or uncertainty, gradually forming a mental environment where success becomes a natural expectation rather than a distant hope, and the mind begins to seek evidence that supports these internal statements, strengthening confidence in ways that compound over time into a stable identity that operates with increasing clarity, focus, and resilience as repetition continues shaping deeper layers of thought that eventually influence not just behavior, but perception itself, altering how challenges are interpreted and approached in daily life, where each repeated phrase builds another layer of mental conditioning that slowly but consistently becomes indistinguishable from belief as the subconscious continues integrating these messages into its foundational programming. Without resistance or doubt, gradually forming a dominant internal narrative that begins to guide attention, effort, and persistence toward outcomes that align with the repeated direction, until eventually the line between spoken affirmation and lived identity starts to blur and reshape the entire framework of self-perception in ways that continue unfolding deeper into thought patterns that govern reaction, decision, and expectation without conscious effort or interruption. Clarity of intention in the morning creates disciplined action throughout the day, because when the mind begins the day with a defined direction, it no longer wastes energy negotiating with distractions that constantly compete for attention in a world filled with noise and urgency. Most people wake up and immediately allow the day to decide them, reacting to messages, obligations, and emotions without first deciding what truly matters. And this absence of intention creates a subtle internal chaos that follows them from morning until night. But when a person takes even a few quiet moments to define exactly what they want to accomplish, not just in tasks, but in mindset and behavior, they establish a mental framework that filters every decision through purpose rather than impulse. This clarity acts like a compass that keeps attention aligned, even when external pressures attempt to pull focus in multiple directions, because the mind now has a reference point that makes saying no easier than saying yes to everything. Without intention, energy is scattered, and scattered energy always leads to average results. But with intention, even simple actions become meaningful, because they are connected to a larger direction that gives them weight and consistency throughout the day. This is where discipline is actually born, not in moments of pressure, but in moments of preparation, because the morning intention silently pre-decides how a person will respond when challenges arise later in the day. When clarity is strong, distractions lose their authority and procrastination loses its grip, because the mind is no longer asking, "What should I do next?" but instead executing what has already been decided with reduced emotional resistance. Over time, this practice rewires identity, turning a reactive individual into a deliberate one, where actions are not driven by mood but by a pre-established standard set at the beginning of the day. This is why high achievement often appears effortless from the outside, because the discipline was not created in the moment of action, but in the quiet clarity of intention that came before the world had any influence. And as this pattern continues daily, the mind begins to trust its own direction more than external stimulation, building a steady internal structure that supports consistency, focus, and execution, even under pressure, uncertainty, or delay, reinforcing it through repeated execution that strengthens confidence, sharpens focus, and reduces internal conflict as the day progresses, and each decision becomes easier as clarity stays active in thought, guiding priorities and shaping responses as situations unfold and opportunities appear that align with the morning direction. What you say to yourself repeatedly becomes your inner belief system in a way that slowly replaces external conditioning with internal certainty, because the mind is constantly listening to your own voice more than any other influence. Most people assume beliefs are formed only through major life events, education, or experiences, but in reality, the most powerful shaping force is the quiet repetition of self-directed language that runs through the mind every day without interruption. When a person repeatedly tells themselves they are not good enough, not ready, or not capable, those statements do not remain as temporary thoughts, but begin to settle into the subconscious as assumed truths that guide perception and behavior. Over time, this internal repetition forms a baseline identity, meaning the mind starts to accept certain limitations or strengths as fixed parts of who the person is, even when there is no objective evidence supporting those beliefs. This is why self-talk is not just conversation, but programming, because whatever is repeated internally begins to overwrite older patterns that once came from environment, upbringing, or past failures. When this process is consistent in the morning, it becomes especially powerful because the mind is more impressionable before it is filled with external input, making early thoughts more influential than later ones. A person who repeatedly affirms focus, discipline, and capability begins to act in alignment with those words not because of forced effort, but because the subconscious starts to treat them as natural identity markers. This alignment reduces internal conflict because there is less distance between what a person believes and what they do, which creates consistency in behavior even in moments of stress or uncertainty. As repetition continues over weeks and months, the mind begins to defend these beliefs, filtering out contradictory thoughts and reinforcing the dominant narrative that has been repeatedly installed. This is the stage where belief becomes identity, because the internal voice no longer feels like something separate from the self, but instead becomes the standard through which all decisions are evaluated. And as this identity strengthens, actions begin to require less motivation because behavior is now driven by what the mind already accepts as true rather than what it is trying to prove. Eventually, the repeated internal voice becomes the silent architect of decisions, shaping how challenges are interpreted and how opportunities are approached in daily life. And this is why the smallest morning statements, repeated with consistency, gradually build the invisible foundation of confidence, discipline, and direction that begins to influence not only how a person thinks, but how they respond under pressure in ways that feel automatic, natural, and deeply embedded in who they are becoming in ongoing development over time. A powerful morning statement can shift emotions, decisions, and long-term destiny because it does not stay limited to words spoken in isolation, but instead sets off a chain reaction inside the mind that influences how a person feels, how they interpret situations, and how they choose to respond throughout the entire day and beyond. Emotion is often the first layer affected, because the human mind is highly sensitive in the morning state, where thoughts have not yet been fully occupied by external demands, meaning a simple internal statement can act like a trigger that either stabilizes or destabilizes emotional direction. When a person begins the day with statements of strength, clarity, and purpose, the emotional tone tends to align with those words, gradually replacing anxiety or uncertainty with a more centered and controlled inner state, not because circumstances have changed, but because perception has been directed before circumstances could interfere. This emotional alignment then influences decision-making, since decisions are rarely purely logical and are often filtered through the emotional condition of the moment, meaning a calm and focused inner state leads to more deliberate choices, while a scattered emotional state leads to impulsive or reactive behavior. Over time, this repeated morning influence begins to shape patterns of decision-making that feel natural and automatic, as the mind starts to associate certain emotional states with certain types of choices, reinforcing a consistent direction in behavior. As days turn into weeks, these small emotional and decision-based shifts begin to accumulate, creating a larger trajectory that appears externally as life direction, but internally is simply the result of repeated mental conditioning established each morning. This is where the concept of long-term destiny begins to take shape, not as something distant or abstract, but as the natural outcome of repeated emotional states and repeated decisions that compound silently over time. A person who consistently begins their day with empowering internal language is essentially programming their emotional baseline, which then influences the quality of choices they make in relationships, work, discipline, and response to challenges. And those choices, when repeated, become habits, and habits eventually become the structure of a life path. What begins as a simple morning statement slowly evolves into a directional force that shapes identity, expectation, and resilience under pressure, because the mind begins to trust the pattern it has been repeatedly exposed to each day, reinforcing confidence in its own interpretation of reality and gradually altering how opportunities are recognized, how setbacks are processed, and how persistence is maintained even when results are not immediate, creating a subtle but continuous shift in trajectory that keeps unfolding through emotional regulation, decision consistency, and internal dialogue that keeps reinforcing the same direction over and over until the identity itself begins to align with the repeated morning message, and the future starts responding differently as internal alignment deepens and expands into areas of life that once felt disconnected or uncertain, and the pattern continues building into something larger than individual moments, shaping the unseen architecture of choices, reactions, and expectations that guide movement through time and experience without resistance or hesitation or doubt, forming a quiet but powerful momentum that keeps growing in the background of thought and behavior and silently directing attention toward possibilities that match the repeated internal narrative that began each morning and continues influencing everything that follows as life gradually reorganizes itself around what the mind repeatedly accepts as true and possible and normal and expected and real. And now, as we come to the end of this message, remember this one truth. Your life will never rise beyond the level of your daily thoughts, and your daily thoughts are shaped in the quiet moments you often ignore. Every morning is not just a routine, it is a reset point, a fresh opportunity to decide who you will become before the world decides for you. The words you speak to yourself are not small. They are building blocks of your identity, your discipline, your confidence, and ultimately, your future. If you truly commit to controlling your inner voice each morning, you are not just improving your day, you are redesigning your entire direction in life. Do not underestimate the power of consistency. You don't need a perfect day, you need a powerful start. You don't need everything to change overnight. You need the courage to speak differently to yourself every single morning, even when it feels simple, even when it feels invisible. Because change does not announce itself loudly. It quietly builds in repetition until one day you realize you are no longer the same person who used to doubt, delay, or give up easily. So take this with you. Guard your mornings, guard your thoughts, and guard your words to yourself. Let your first conversation of the day be one that strengthens you, not weakens you. And over time, you will see that the life you once only imagined starts responding to the person you are becoming from the inside out. Good luck on your journey of transformation, and thank you for spending this time with this message. If this resonated with you, make sure to follow my channel Mind Wealth Theory for more powerful insights that can help you reshape your thinking, elevate your mindset, and build a stronger version of yourself every single day.